Hi students, and welcome to Chapter 3, the first part, which is Ecosystems Review. This is for Chapter 3.1 to 3.4. So first, before we get into ecosystems, we have to look at where those ecosystems exist. And so the Earth is layered, and you learned this way back in elementary school, but the layering is based on densities all the way up through the atmosphere, which isn't shown in this diagram. Gravity is what holds everything together, and our magnetic field, which is really important, protects our atmosphere from being stripped away by the solar wind. It also protects life on Earth from ionizing radiation, and it provides us the components we need in order to survive, like oxygen. So what are the energy sources for Earth? The energy sources are basically, there's two main sources. One is solar energy that comes from the sun, and the other one is geothermal energy that comes from within the Earth. So we're kind of at that what we call the Goldilocks zone for habitability in our solar system, and that we're not too close to the sun, not too far from the sun, so we can have liquid water. But it turns out that geothermal forces are greater than we might have realized, especially in early Earth, for how life might have gotten started on planet Earth. So there's two different kinds of components when you're looking at ecosystems. There's abiotic, which is all the non-living components. And so, you know, water, air, nutrients, rocks, heat, solar energy, all of that, those are abiotic, versus biotic, which is all the living and used to be living. So things like leaf litter would be considered biotic because it used to be living. So there's this thing called the limiting factor principle, which means that too little or too much of any factor can limit or prevent growth of a population. Even if all your other factors are ideal and near the optimal range, just even one thing can cause your, say, garden not to grow. So one of the things in our Pacific Northwest is that we have pretty poor soil. It's very nitrogen depleted. And this can mean that your vegetables and whatnot may not grow unless you amend your soil and add some nitrogen to it. But any abiotic factor can be a limiting factor. So this just shows, you know, if you add fertilizer to your crops, I don't know what the date of this picture is, but you can see with and without fertilizer what it can do for how well your plants grow. There's also a optimal range for temperature. So there's a range of tolerance for all organisms, humans included. Fish and other marine organisms can be very sensitive to temperature changes too. So too cold, they can't survive. Too hot, they won't survive either. So again, there's this optimal range. So these are kind of some definitions and some vocabulary that goes back to biology days. But producers, I usually call them that. They're also called autotrophs, is like the fancy biology word. And there are two different ways that you can produce that autotrophs can exist. One is through photosynthesis, which is something you're probably much more familiar with. But there's a secondary process called chemosynthesis, which actually I'm pretty familiar with because I worked on that with part of my master's thesis in oceanography. And then you have all the things that are consumers. And if they consume just plants, they're called primary consumers, all the way up secondary, tertiary, and higher. Generally, you don't go too high up a food chain, more than the third or fourth level, because of that rule of 10%, that ecological efficiency concept, where you lose so much energy with each step that by the time you go too high up a food chain, there's just not enough energy to sustain those organisms. So what about this photosynthesis and chemosynthesis thing? I find it really interesting because photosynthesis, as you know, uses the sun for energy. And when that sun hits the chloroplasts, which are embedded in plants and part of the plant, they do photosynthesis. And you take the carbon dioxide from the air, the energy from the sun, and you mix the carbon dioxide with water, and you can make some sort of carbohydrate or sugar and oxygen. That's photosynthesis, and I know you've studied that well before in your previous classes. But what about chemosynthesis? Turns out there's a parallel process that goes on very commonly on ocean floor vents, where the energy comes from the heat and chemicals. They called chemosynthesis from the chemicals, but the energy source is actually hydrothermal vents coming, and the heat from that is the interior of the Earth. That provides the energy. And then you have the sulfite oxidizing bacteria, which is kind of like the chloroplasts, and they perform the chemosynthesis. And then you have organisms like tube worms, in which that sulfite oxidizing bacteria live, and they start the food chain from there. What's really interesting is that biologists that I took classes from think that chloroplasts were probably once independent organisms, like a single-celled organisms, much the way the sulfide oxidizing bacteria is now. But the chloroplasts have now been fully incorporated into plants, and so that they're no longer separate organisms the way this bacteria, the sulfide guys, are still separate organisms. I'm a geologist, so I don't know how to judge that, but I trust these people with PhDs in biology that they think that those chloroplasts were once their own organisms. All right, so when you lay these guys side by side, there's some like huge differences. I just told you about the parallel processes, but if you look at what they produce, you know, so photosynthesis produces oxygen, which is what we need to survive. And chemosynthesis, that other byproduct that one makes besides the carbohydrates is sulfuric acid, which is very toxic to us. But it turns out there's organisms on the ocean floor that live on that. And we'll get into more of this with our biodiversity unit coming up. But we actually think that life on Earth probably got started at vents like these, both from the genetic, there's very ancient genetic organisms living there called archaea, but also early Earth would have been a very poor place to get photosynthesis going because we were bashed so often by meteorites that our sun would have been pretty obscured in the very early days of Earth. So there are some commonalities, but there's also some big differences there. So the commonalities is that there are sugars produced, hydrogen and carbon dioxide are consumed. But again, the differences are that you get that oxygen in photosynthesis, which is what we want. And in chemosynthesis, you get sulfuric acid. Okay, so what about the energy then? So all organisms store energy in sugars and other organic molecules, and then that energy is released then through respiration. There's aerobic respiration, which again is probably the one that you're probably most familiar with. And then there is anaerobic respiration, which is also known as fermentation, and that is going to be without oxygen. Plants perform both of these. So most of the time people think that plants are all about photosynthesis, but plants as well as all animals also perform respiration. So some more vocabulary. This is kind of the icky stuff on one end of the cycle of life, and that is the detritivores, which consume dead organisms, and the decomposers, which break down things and put them back into the soil. I tend to not be into this stuff, including mushrooms. I won't touch them for eating or anything, but this is a very important. If we didn't have these organisms out there, we would not be able to cycle matter on planet Earth, which is a pretty important part of the process. So again, we've talked about ecological efficiency before, and just realize that again, at every step in the cycle of life, you're going to be losing some of that energy to heat. And it's not like it's gone, but when it goes off as heat, it's really not very usable. So again, that second law of thermodynamics means that every time you have an energy conversion, you're going to lose some to a lesser form of energy, and usually that's going to be heat. So matter can recycle. It's one of the big concepts for chapter 3. You can recycle matter and nutrients on planet Earth, but energy is a one-way flow. So you need a constant input. Either that's going to be the sun for all of our surface life, or it could be the earth for that chemosynthetic life that I just talked about. So life depends on that. You have to have that energy input or you're not going to keep it going. You also need to have that cycle so that you can keep recycling those nutrients so that it can be used by new life as other things die. This is just another one. I kind of liked this picture that I found on the web. You don't have this in your notes, but I like this picture because it shows the nutrients in there that get cycled versus the energy that has to have that input from the sun, and it has better pictures. Okay, so this is just showing that for the different steps on the food chain. You don't have this picture because it's in your textbook, but you do have some of those blanks at the bottom to be filling in with your notes. That a trophic level is a step in the food chain. And then again, there's this one-way flow of energy. So as you go up the food chain, you look at all the energy that you're losing each step in the process. So that's why you usually don't get higher than about a 4th trophic level. So GPP, gross primary productivity, what is that? So it's the rate at which producers convert solar energy, for most producers, would be the chemosynthetic energy for the other type, into chemical energy. So usually you're measuring this in a unit of energy per unit area over a given span of time. So that's kind of a mouthful, but if you look at the units, it kind of makes a little bit more sense to me. Kilocalories per meter squared per year. So if you're looking at a forest versus a wetland, you can compare them square area by square area over the course of a year, which is more productive in your gross primary productivity. So the problem is though, is that you can never measure gross primary productivity directly because your producers are also consuming at the same time that they're producing. So you can see in this picture that even though they're producing stuff, they are also undergoing respiration where there's energy lost and unavailable to consumers because of that process also. So gross primary productivity, you can't actually measure directly because even your producers are consuming things as they go. So there are some other methods which we'll be looking at in our water quality testing lab. So net primary productivity is something you can measure. What is net primary productivity? Is the amount of chemical energy available after the energy requirements of the producers have been subtracted out. So you have your net primary productivity is your gross, what are all the producers consuming, minus what they take up in their respiration processes. And this can be measured because you can look at how much is being produced extra in a system. So when you're comparing ecosystems and saying which is more productive, you want to look at, okay, so how much biomass is being produced? And there's different ways to actually measure your net primary productivity. One of them is biomass. Which one's going to have a higher one? Estuaries and swamps generally going to have a really high net primary productivity. The reason is that you have a whole lot of nutrients coming in. You have shallow waters, which means good light penetration for the energy for the system, and warm conditions. And again, if things are snowy and icy, you're not going to be growing as much. So again, why do we use the NPP to compare different ecosystems instead of the GPP? Is that we can actually measure NPP, and GPP we can't. So this is a graphic from your book. So I think I didn't give it to you in your lecture notes, but just if you're going to be looking at, okay, do we have the greatest NPP? Think of your tropical green things, your swamps, your marshes, your tropical rainforests. In aquatic ecosystems, estuaries. Again, estuaries are where rivers are dumping out all their nutrients, and that's necessary for your food chain. The open oceans can often, I've heard oceanographers call it a desert. There's just out in the open oceans, you're not going to have a whole lot of nutrient input, and so you're not going to have nearly as much life and nearly as much productivity. So eutrophication, what is that? So it's often you get a eutrophied lake when you have too many nutrients coming into the system. So usually phosphorus or nitrogen, and these can happen because of runoff from fertilizers, detergents coming from our water, and it flows into a body of water and it sets off a cascade that is often not very pleasant. So if you look at the picture at the bottom, that green murky stuff, so what happens when you put too much nutrients into a system? So first thing that happens is you get an algae bloom. So that's what turns it green and murky. So the algae just take off. Now you might think that might be good for life because algae produce a lot of oxygen, but it turns out that there's so much algae that's produced that the decomposers then go crazy and they start breaking down all that dead algae. Decomposers consume oxygen. So that process is what actually depletes the oxygen in the water body. When that happens, you get very low oxygen in your body of water, and you can get either hypoxia, which is low oxygen, or anoxia, which is no oxygen. All fish need a certain level of oxygen to survive, and dissolved oxygen is something we'll be looking at in some of our labs. But if the dissolved oxygen in the water drops too low, your fish start to become stressed, and then at a certain point, they can't survive anymore. The opposite of eutrophic is oligotrophic. So when you think oligotrophic, think nice blue, clear waters, and oligo means few. So what do you have few of? You have a low nutrient supply, so you don't have a huge primary productivity, and so you have clear water, less plankton. And that might seem like, well, then do you have enough stuff for things to live off of? And the answer is yes, because you're not going to deplete your oxygen because of an algae bloom that then all the decomposers go crazy with. Eutrophic then is the opposite. So you get excess nutrients, high primary productivity, you get that murky water from all that algae, huge phytoplankton population, but then the decomposers are the ones that are going to basically eat that algae and take the oxygen out of the water. So there's a picture of eutrophic versus oligotrophic. Eutrophic is this one here on the right. Oligotrophic is the one on the left. And when you look at what makes eutrophic, what's going to, besides getting excess nutrients dumped in, stagnant water. So water that's not getting flushed and cleaned out. So water that's like a lake that's fully contained and doesn't have anything draining into it or out of it, they're going to be more prone to eutrophication. So I thought maybe what would be kind of cool would be to give you our own local example of a eutrophied lake, and that is Green Lake. So it was discovered in 1855, back when Seattle was still a very young town, and it had seasonal algae blooms, and that's why they named it Green Lake. If you go to Green Lake today, it doesn't look very green, and that's actually probably a good thing. So what actually caused those algae blooms was, and you guys have probably seen this with Lake Washington too, but we have a large number of geese in the area, and bird poop is full of nutrients, especially phosphorus. So they think then, and every year Green Lake gets bombarded with just tons of geese. And so that the excess nutrients flows into that water. So the other thing that happened with Green Lake is that it was highly engineered. So as Seattle, the city, started growing, they lowered the lake level to have more shoreline. They also built all around it, and they cut off the flow from Ravenna Creek into Green Lake. So they made it basically stagnant water that was no longer mixing and getting flushed out. So this actually made the eutrophication worse. Other things that happened, and that invasive species got in. So invasive species, we're going to learn again in next unit, they don't usually have any natural predators. And so when invasive species come into an ecosystem, they can take over. So in the case of Green Lake, the milfoil, the Eurasian milfoil got in. It makes these thick mats. You probably have seen it in Lake Washington too, and that's added to the eutrophication problems. So they tried ways to try to get rid of the eutrophication, and such like natural methods like adding fish to eat the milfoil, and none of it worked. So some things that have worked and made things better is they have tried to redirect local springs and overflows from city reservoirs into Green Lake to help dilute those nutrients in there. But at the end of the day, they've ended up using chemical methods. Early on, they used copper sulfate, and like at school, we have to like be very careful whenever we use copper sulfate to dispose of it properly. It's highly toxic. They actually put that in Green Lake to try to kill things off. And chlorine, again, you don't want to be putting those in natural systems. So more recently, they are using aluminum sulfate. And what aluminum sulfate does is it binds with it reacts with the phosphorus, and I think it actually precipitates it out. So you remove those nutrients from the water, and then Green Lake looks the way it does in that lower picture, which is nice and clear. So I believe that is the end of this lecture. And again, you should have been following along with your lecture notes, and the next lecture will be looking at nutrient cycles.